The year was 1956, and the ocean liner Andrea Doria was a floating palace. She was the pride of Italy, a symbol of post-war recovery and luxury. People called her unsinkable, a marvel of modern engineering, designed with 16 watertight compartments that promised safety, even if 2 were breached. Her maiden voyage was a grand affair, and she regularly sailed the route from Genoa in Italy, across the vast Atlantic, to the bustling port of New York. Every detail, from the opulent ballrooms to the exquisite dining halls, screamed elegance and sophistication. For those who could afford a ticket, it was more than just a trip. It was an experience, a statement of status, a journey wrapped in comfort and anticipation. Among the many passengers enjoying this luxurious crossing was a 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. She was traveling with her family, her stepfather, mother, and younger sister, Joan. For Linda, this voyage was a dream come true. The ship felt enormous, a world unto itself filled with new sights and sounds. She spent her days exploring the decks, giggling with her sister, and imagining all the possibilities that awaited them in America. The sea air was fresh, the sun often bright, and the future seemed boundless. Linda was at that innocent age where the world was still full of wonder, and this grand ship was carrying her towards new adventures. Her youthful excitement was a quiet hum beneath the ship's engines, a personal soundtrack to her journey. She had no idea that her life and the lives of everyone on board were about to change forever. Meanwhile, another ship was making its way across the same ocean. This was the MS Stockholm, a vessel of a very different character. Operated by the Swedish-American line, the Stockholm was smaller, tougher, and built to handle the icy conditions of the North Atlantic. Her hull was reinforced, designed to cut through ice, and her purpose was more utilitarian, carrying passengers and cargo from New York to Gothenburg, Sweden. She wasn't known for the Andrea Doria's glamour, but for her reliability and sturdy construction. The Stockholm was a workhorse, not a show horse, and her crew was focused on the job, navigating the vast, often unforgiving waters. As both ships pressed on, the weather began to turn. A thick, soupy fog rolled in, slowly at first, then becoming dense and suffocating. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, turning the wide-open ocean into a claustrophobic tunnel. The ship's courses, set by navigators relying on early, somewhat rudimentary radar technology, were converging. Each vessel was a world apart, yet unknowingly they were drawing closer, their paths intersecting in the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic. The limitations of the radar systems of the time meant that what appeared on the screen wasn't always a precise reflection of reality. There were blind spots, ghost images, and interpretations that could be and would be tragically wrong. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with moisture and an unspoken tension. Inside the Andrea Doria, most passengers were oblivious to the growing peril outside. They dined, danced, and slept, lulled by the gentle rhythm of the waves. Linda, tucked into her bed, probably dreamt of New York, of new schools and friends, her mind far away from any danger. On the Stockholm, the crew navigated cautiously through the fog, but the passengers, too, were largely unaware of the impending crisis. The quiet anticipation of the night, the rhythmic hum of the engines, the muffled sounds of the ship moving through water, these were the final moments of peace before everything shattered. The ocean, usually a symbol of freedom, was about to become a stage for an unimaginable catastrophe. The stage was set, the players unknowingly in position, and the curtain was about to fall on their peaceful journeys. The sudden, terrifying sound ripped through the quiet night. It wasn't just a bump or a scrape. It was a deafening metallic shriek, like a giant beast tearing itself apart. The Andrea Doria shuddered violently, a deep, sickening lurch that threw everything and everyone off balance. Steel groaned, twisted, and then tore with a sound that would haunt survivors for years. The Stockholm, like an unforgiving spear, had plunged its ice-strengthened bow deep into the Andrea Doria's starboard side, directly into the cabins where many passengers were sleeping. The force of the collision was unimaginable, a brutal instant rearrangement of tons of metal and human lives. Immediately, chaos erupted. The elegant ship, moments before a haven of luxury, became a scene of terror. Screams, sharp and piercing, mixed with the groaning of the dying ship, and the rush of incoming water. The Andrea Doria began to list almost instantly, tilting dangerously to one side, making it nearly impossible to walk. Passengers, jolted awake, found themselves scrambling in the dark. Their cabins now slanted floors or walls. The smell of fuel oil, raw and acrid, mingled with the salty tang of the ocean and the coppery scent of blood. Lights flickered, then died, plunging sections of the ship into total darkness, amplifying the panic. Linda in her cabin was directly in the path of the Stockholm's bow. The world simply exploded around her. One moment she was in her bed, probably dreaming. The next she was airborne. The incredible force of the impact ripped through the ship's structure, pulverizing everything in its path. She didn't fall. She was launched. The bed, the walls, the furniture, everything disintegrated or was pushed aside. Linda was propelled from her bunk with such power that she flew through the gaping hole created by the collision. It was an impossible, violent trajectory, a human projectile launched into the heart of the disaster. Through the darkness and the shattering debris, Linda somehow cleared the jagged edges of the Andrea Doria's wound. She soared across the narrow space between the two ships, a space now filled with mangled metal and rushing air. Her body, small and fragile, was tossed completely clear of her collapsing cabin. Then, against all odds, she landed, not in the churning, freezing water below, but on the damaged bow of the Stockholm. It was a landing brutal enough to cause significant injury, but it was a landing nonetheless, not a plunge into the abyss. She lay there, disoriented, aching and bleeding, surrounded by twisted metal and the sounds of the ongoing catastrophe, barely conscious but miraculously alive. The sheer improbability of her survival and her bizarre location defied all logic. It wasn't long before her presence was discovered. On the Stockholm, crew members were assessing the damage to their own vessel, a massive, jagged hole in its bow. Amidst the debris and the initial shock, one of them spotted something completely out of place, a small still form dressed in pajamas. It was Linda. The crew members were utterly shocked, their disbelief palpable. How could a passenger from the other ship, a child, have ended up on their bow? It made no sense. But there she was, a living, breathing testament to the unimaginable violence of the collision. They rushed to her side, immediate efforts focusing on checking for life, providing comfort, and trying to make sense of the impossible. Linda was alive, but her ordeal and the greater tragedy had only just begun. The Andrea Doria's fate was sealed almost immediately. The severe damage to its starboard side, coupled with the rapid flooding of key compartments, meant the ship was doomed. Below decks, the chaos was absolute. The crew, despite their training, struggled against the overwhelming force of the listing ship and the terror of the passengers. They tried to maintain order, shouting instructions, but the ship was already dying. Water poured in, lights failed completely in many areas, and the list grew worse by the minute, making every step a fight against gravity. The realization that the ship was going down spread like wildfire, adding to the desperation. Meanwhile, somewhere in that hellish maze, Linda's parents and her sister Joan were trapped. They were in a different part of the ship, one that thankfully hadn't been directly hit but was still reeling from the impact. Their first thought, their only thought, was Linda. Where was she? Had she made it out of her cabin? They called her name, their voices raw with fear, pushing through crowds of confused and injured passengers. They searched frantically, trying to navigate the steeply angled corridors, their hearts pounding with every creak and groan of the ship. Every face they saw wasn't hers. Every empty space was a fresh stab of dread. They didn't know she was already on another ship, a miracle unfolding while they searched for her ghost in the wreckage. Slowly, agonizingly, rescue efforts began. The Andrea Doria's radio operators sent out distress calls, but in 1956 information traveled slower, and the thick fog made immediate visual identification impossible. Other ships, some quite far away, began to alter course, but it would take hours for them to arrive. The challenges were immense. The darkness, the lingering fog, the sheer number of people needing help, and the fact that the Andrea Doria was sinking fast. Still, heroes emerged. Crew members, and even some passengers, worked tirelessly trying to help the injured guide people to higher decks and prepare the few lifeboats that could still be launched from the severely tilted ship. On the Stockholm, Linda was receiving initial care. The crew members who found her quickly brought her inside, away from the cold night air and the scene of the collision. She was in rough shape, cuts, bruises, and likely a concussion. They tended to her injuries as best they could, wrapping her in blankets. She was confused, her mind a jumble of terrifying images and pain. She mumbled, trying to make sense of where she was, why she was hurting, and what had happened. She knew she wasn't on the Andrea Doria anymore, but the reality of being on the ship that had caused the disaster was too much for her young mind to process. The language barrier didn't help. She spoke English, and most of the Stockholm crew spoke Swedish, though some understood English. They tried to reassure her, to tell her she was safe, but the truth of her situation was almost unbelievable. As the hours dragged on, a terrifying rumor mill began to churn among the survivors and those still waiting for rescue on the Andrea Doria. Wild stories spread about the number of dead, about entire sections of the ship being underwater. Despair grew, especially for those who couldn't find their loved ones. Every face scanned, every question asked, brought more fear than hope. The chance of finding someone alive after such a catastrophic impact seemed to shrink with every passing minute. Yet in the midst of this growing darkness, a slim, almost impossible hope was about to emerge, a whisper of a miracle that would soon cut through the fog of confusion and grief. Linda slowly started to regain her senses, the fog in her mind lifting a little, though not completely. She was still in pain, a dull ache throbbing through her head and body, but the immediate shock was fading. She tried to speak, to ask questions, but the words came out garbled, her tongue feeling thick and clumsy. The crew members around her, kind but mostly speaking Swedish, tried to understand. She pointed to herself, then tried to say, "Linda," and then Morgan, hoping they would grasp her name. She gestured wildly, trying to explain she had been on the other ship, the Andrea Doria, and that her family was there. It was frustrating, like trying to shout underwater. They offered her water, tried to make her comfortable, but the full picture of what she was trying to convey seemed lost in translation and the general chaos on their own ship. The Stockholm itself was in a bad way. Its bow was crumpled, a gaping wound where it had slammed into the Andrea Doria. Water was rushing into its forward compartments, and the crew was working frantically to assess the damage and keep their own vessel afloat. Pumps were running, bulkheads were being shored up, and the captain faced an impossible decision: stay and help with the rescue of the Andrea Doria passengers, or try to save his own ship and the lives already on board. They were a rescue ship now, but also a ship in distress. The focus was split, a desperate balancing act between two unfolding tragedies. Meanwhile, news of the collision had exploded across the world. Initial reports were chaotic and often contradictory. Casualty figures were speculated, entire families were reported missing, and the scale of the disaster began to sink in. News agencies scrambled for any scrap of information, their teletypes clattering endlessly. The collision of two passenger liners in the Atlantic was a massive story, one that gripped the public and sent shivers down the spines of anyone who had ever traveled by sea. Everyone wanted to know what happened, who was to blame, and how many had survived. It was amidst this global frenzy that a small miracle began to take shape. On the Stockholm, after Linda had been given some basic medical attention, a crew member, or perhaps even a journalist who had been on board, took a photograph of the injured girl. She looked dazed, her hair disheveled, a blanket wrapped around her small frame, but she was alive. This photo, along with the incredible story of how she was found, began to circulate. Someone, perhaps a sharp-eyed reporter or a member of the rescue coordination team, put two and two together. The girl in the photo, found on the Stockholm, was identified as Linda Morgan, a passenger from the Andrea Doria. The sheer improbability of it was staggering. She had been tossed from her bed on one ship and landed on the other. It was a story almost too wild to be true, but there she was, living proof. The message, fragmented at first, slowly made its way through the communication channels. It reached the rescue ships, then the lifeboats, and eventually, incredibly, it reached Linda's family. Her parents and sister, still reeling from the shock of the collision and their desperate, fruitless search for her. were huddled on one of the rescue vessels that had arrived on the scene. They had been told there was little hope, that many had been lost. Then a whisper, a relayed message, a stunning piece of news. Linda Morgan is alive. She's on the Stockholm. Shock, disbelief, and then an overwhelming wave of relief washed over them. It was a moment of pure, raw emotion, a beacon of light in the darkest of nights. Their daughter, who they had feared lost forever, was alive, incredibly, miraculously alive, on the very ship that had caused their ordeal. The sheer irony, the impossible twist of fate, was almost too much to comprehend. The Andrea Doria was in its final agony. The ship's list grew steeper by the minute, tilting so sharply that walking became a desperate scramble. Below decks the chaos intensified. Water poured into the breached compartments, and the once luxurious interiors became a labyrinth of twisted metal and submerged furniture. The crew, despite their exhaustion and the grim reality unfolding around them, continued their heroic efforts to launch lifeboats. But many of the davits, designed for a ship on an even keel, were now useless, stuck at impossible angles. Lifeboats hung askew, unable to be lowered, or crashed into the ship's side as they attempted descent. For those still on board, the struggle for survival was becoming increasingly desperate, a race against time and the unforgiving sea. The once proud liner was slowly, inexorably, giving up its fight. Then a lifeline appeared on the horizon. Slowly but steadily, the first of many rescue vessels began to arrive. The Île-de-France, a grand French ocean liner, was among the first and largest, its lights cutting through the lingering fog like beacons of hope. It was a truly immense sight, a floating city coming to the aid of another. Soon, other ships joined the growing armada, tankers, cargo ships, even a U.S. Navy destroyer. The scene was overwhelming, a testament to maritime tradition and the universal call for help. A vast, unplanned coordination began, with ships positioning themselves around the listing Andrea Doria, ready to take on survivors. The sheer scale of the rescue operation was unlike anything seen before, an impromptu fleet working together to pluck hundreds of people from the jaws of disaster. Amidst this massive rescue effort, Linda's parents and sister were among those safely evacuated from the Andrea Doria. They were lowered into a lifeboat, then transferred to one of the waiting rescue ships. The journey across the dark, choppy water was a blur of relief and lingering terror. On board the rescue vessel, they found themselves surrounded by other survivors, all sharing the same dazed expressions, the same shared trauma. There were hugs, tears, and whispered tales of escape, but for Linda's family, a single thought dominated their minds: Linda. The news that she was alive, on the Stockholm, was still sinking in. It was a miracle, yes, but it also meant an agonizing separation. The realization hit them hard. Linda was safe, but she was on a different ship, heading in a different direction. The Stockholm, though damaged, was making its way back to New York. They, along with hundreds of other Andrea Doria survivors, were likely headed to New York as well, but on a separate vessel. The immediate comforting reunion they desperately craved was not possible. The anguish of not being able to immediately hold their daughter, to see her with their own eyes, was immense. But the promise of a future reunion, the knowledge that she was alive, was enough to sustain them through the uncertainty. They clung to that hope, a beacon in the emotional wreckage. As the last survivors were taken off, the Andrea Doria made its final dramatic stand. The ship rolled further onto its side, its starboard flank rising high out of the water, revealing its scarred underside. For a few agonizing minutes it hung there, a ghostly silhouette against the dawn sky, a monument to its own demise. Then, with a slow, mournful groan of metal, it began its final plunge. The stern rose, the bow dipped, and the once proud liner slid beneath the waves, disappearing into the cold, deep Atlantic. A profound silence fell over the assembled rescue fleet, a collective gasp. The Andrea Doria was gone, taking with it a sense of loss that marked the end of an era for ocean travel. The dramatic visual of its capsizing and disappearance was etched into the memories of all who witnessed it, a stark reminder of the ocean's power and the fragility of even the grandest human creations. The battered Stockholm, Its bow, a mangled mess, began its slow, painful journey back to New York. On board, the atmosphere was a mix of relief, exhaustion, and a strange kind of excitement. News of Linda Morgan's miraculous survival had spread like wildfire, transforming her into an instant celebrity. The ship, limping its way across the ocean, carried not just survivors but a living legend. Every crew member and passenger who saw Linda knew they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. She was still recovering from her injuries, her body sore and bruised, but her spirit, though shaken, was intact. She was a symbol of hope, a testament to the unpredictable nature of fate. The anxious wait for the Stockholm's arrival in New York intensified with each passing hour. As the world clamored for more details about the collision and the incredible story of the miracle girl. Back on one of the rescue ships, Linda's mother, now safe but utterly drained, focused every fiber of her being on one thing: getting to her daughter. Her own ordeal on the sinking Andrea Doria was a distant memory, overshadowed by the burning need to see Linda. The logistical challenges were immense. She was on a different vessel, heading to a different pier, but none of that mattered. She had to get to New York, and she had to get there fast. Her resolve was unwavering, a fierce maternal instinct overriding her own trauma and fatigue. Strangers offered comfort, fellow survivors shared their silent understanding, but her mind was already in New York, imagining the moment she would finally hold her daughter again. Meanwhile, Linda, still aboard the Stockholm, was becoming the subject of an intense media frenzy. Reporters and photographers, already gathering in New York, were desperate for any scrap of information, any photograph of the girl who had been tossed from one ship to another and lived. She was not just a survivor. She was the survivor, a captivating headline in a story already filled with drama. This sudden, unwanted fame was overwhelming for a 14-year-old girl. She found herself the focus of probing questions, her personal trauma dissected for public consumption. She struggled to cope with the sudden attention, wanting nothing more than to be reunited with her family and to somehow make sense of the unbelievable events that had unfolded. Linda's mother's journey to New York was fraught with emotion and anticipation. Every mile brought her closer, every wave a reminder of the ocean's power and the fragile line between life and death. The support she received from strangers was a small comfort, but her heart ached for her daughter. She pictured Linda, imagined her face, wondered how she was truly doing. The thought of their reunion was the only thing that kept her going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her rescue ship docked in New York. The city was a blur of flashing lights and shouting voices, but her focus remained singular. She pushed through the crowds, her eyes scanning, searching, driven by an urgent need. The moment of reunion finally arrived. A powerful scene played out against the backdrop of the bustling New York pier. It was a raw, emotional embrace, filled with tears and overwhelming relief. Linda, still frail, collapsed into her mother's arms. No words were needed, only the physical confirmation that they were both alive, both safe. It was a moment of profound hope amidst the wreckage of tragedy, a powerful image that captured the resilience of the human spirit. The world watched, captivated by the story of a mother and daughter reunited against all odds, a testament to the enduring power of family love in the face of unimaginable disaster. This reunion, so eagerly awaited, was a beacon of light, a tangible end to the fear and uncertainty that had gripped them both. The emotional reunion on the pier was just the beginning of a long and complicated aftermath. As the initial shock wore off, the reality of what had happened set in, not just for Linda and her family, but for everyone involved. The collision triggered immediate investigations into its cause. Both the Italian line, owners of the Andrea Doria, and the Swedish-American line, owners of the Stockholm, launched their own inquiries. Soon, complex legal proceedings began, with each company pointing fingers, trying to assign blame and seek compensation for their losses, both human and material. It turned into a drawn-out battle in courtrooms, a fight over radar readings, navigation errors, and who had the right of way in the dense fog. For the survivors, the trauma didn't simply vanish with their rescue. The long-term psychological impact was immense. Linda, like many others, carried the weight of that night. Rebuilding lives after such a catastrophic event was a huge challenge. Many found it hard to sleep, plagued by nightmares, or developed a deep fear of the ocean. Support networks and therapy, though not as readily available or understood as today, became crucial for some. The shared experience, however horrific, also forged unexpected bonds between strangers who had faced death together. Linda herself tried to return to a normal life. She went back to school, tried to pick up where she left off, but things were never truly the same. The physical scars from her injuries healed over time, but the emotional ones ran much deeper. For many years she was reluctant to discuss the event publicly. The memory was too raw, too personal. She wanted to move forward, away from the label of miracle girl and the constant reminders of that night. The collision had fundamentally altered her perception of safety, of chance, and of life itself. Meanwhile, the Andrea Doria itself became more than just a sunken ship. It transformed into a famous shipwreck, a ghost beneath the waves, and eventually a challenging dive site for experienced divers. Its place in maritime history was cemented, not just as a symbol of luxury and Italian design, but also as a stark reminder of tragedy. The disaster forced a critical examination of navigation practices, especially regarding radar use, and led to significant improvements in maritime safety protocols. Lessons were learned, often at a great cost, about how ships operate in congested waters and how they respond to emergencies. Despite the investigations and the legal findings, some questions lingered. The debate about who was truly at fault continued for decades. Was it the Andrea Doria's captain for speeding in fog, or the Stockholm's officer for a misinterpretation of radar? The what-ifs and the alternative scenarios were endless, fueling speculation and discussion among maritime enthusiasts and historians. The collision remained a puzzle, a moment of tragic miscalculation that fascinated people, and its details were revisited countless times. The story, particularly Linda's incredible survival, ensured that the Andrea Doria and Stockholm collision would continue to capture the public imagination, a testament to the unpredictable nature of the sea and the fragility of human endeavor. The lingering questions added to the mystique, keeping the memory of that fateful night alive and prompting continued reflection on the unseen forces at play. Years after the collision, Linda Morgan made a deeply personal decision. She would visit Stockholm, Sweden. It wasn't just a trip, it was a pilgrimage, a way to confront her past head-on. She needed to stand on the ground of the country whose ship had, in a bizarre twist of fate, both caused her trauma and saved her life. This journey was her own way of closing a circle, of understanding a piece of her history that had been so violently separated from her own ship. The city itself, a beautiful collection of islands and waterways, offered a serene contrast to the violent chaos of her memory. It was a step towards healing, a quiet defiance against the shadow that had followed her for so long. Linda often reflected on the sheer improbability of her survival. She called it a miracle, not in a religious sense, but in the way something so statistically impossible had simply happened. Being thrown from one ship and landing on another, hundreds of feet away, was an event that defied all logic and reason. This unique experience, this bizarre twist of fate, had profoundly shaped her life. It gave her a deep sense of gratitude, a feeling that every day was a gift. The event became a lens through which she viewed the world, making her appreciate the fragility and preciousness of existence. She understood that life could change in an instant, and that every breath was a chance to live fully. This miracle didn't just give her a second chance at life, it gave her a life of purpose. For many years she carried the burden of her story privately, a silent weight, but eventually she found her voice. She began to share her story, not for fame but to connect with others, to show them the power of resilience. She spoke about the importance of living each day as if it were a gift, about overcoming adversity. Her experiences made her compassionate and empathetic, drawing her to causes that supported survivors of trauma and those facing impossible odds. She became an accidental advocate for the human spirit, a living testament to defiance against death. Linda's story, then, became more than just a personal tale of survival. It grew into a powerful testament to the enduring human spirit, a vivid example of resilience and the sheer will to survive against all odds. Her journey from the deck of a sinking ship to the bow of its destroyer highlighted the unpredictable turns of fate and the incredible capacity of individuals to overcome unimaginable challenges. It spoke to universal themes of loss, the struggle for survival, and the long, often difficult path to recovery. Her life became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that even in the darkest moments, hope can emerge from the most unlikely places. The collision of the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm remains a lasting memory in maritime history, a dramatic event that continues to fascinate and instruct. But within that larger narrative of tragedy and lessons learned, Linda Morgan's legacy stands out. She isn't just a survivor. She is a symbol of defying death, a living embodiment of an impossible escape. Her story teaches us that even when tossed between worlds, literally and figuratively, the human spirit can find its footing. The profound impact of that single, tragic event rippled through countless lives. But for Linda Morgan, it forged a path of extraordinary resilience, turning a moment of horror into a lifetime of quiet strength and purpose. Her survival was a whisper of hope in the roar of disaster, a reminder that sometimes, against all reason, life finds a way.